Alright, so for this screencast, we're going to be looking at two attacks against the United States during the 90s. One is the USS Cole, and the next one is the first Trade Center bombing in 1993. So to begin, we'll first do a quick recap that Al-Qaeda does not exist in the early 90s. In the 1980s, some of the leaders of Al-Qaeda were fighting in Afghanistan, primarily being led by this man, Abdullah Azzam, who had an organization called MAK, the Mujahideen, in the Soviet-Afghan War. And the question here is, after the Cold War, should the United States help to rebuild Afghanistan? And I think the answer is going to be no. As a result of that, you start to see a power vacuum and numerous groups competing for power. Taliban will gain power in Afghanistan, and they will allow their religious holy warriors that fought in the 80s for their country remain in the country. And eventually you'll see Abdullah Azzam be killed, possibly by some of the leaders of Al-Qaeda. And you will take, bin Laden would take the new Mujahideen into a different global kind of initiative. So again, just some of the leaders of Al-Qaeda. I always find it interesting that people like al-Zawahiri, Dr. Fatal, al-Suri, Haider Zamar, and Osama bin Laden, all of these guys fought in Afghanistan, as well as Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And you start to see these individuals become leaders, and they influence people like Ramzi Youssef, who is the guy primarily responsible for the 93 Trade Center bombing. And then we have the 9/11 hijackers, the four main perpetrators here, known as the Hamburg Cell. And there they go right there. The 9/11 hijackers, the main lead teams, the pilots, all of them spent time in Hamburg, Germany. This section here comes from the book Perfect Soldiers. Talks about how the Hamburg Cell met at the Al-Quds Mosque. Here they're talking about Muhammad Atta. Let's see, what else? Al-Shihi. And it pretty much just tracks these individuals as they were, going about their lives in the 90s. So who's this guy, Ramzi Youssef? If you don't remember from one of my prior screencasts, Ramzi Youssef is the Trade Center bomber in 1993. He was known for making chocolate, which was code for making bombs. He also was the guy responsible for the attempt to blow up Philippine Airlines Flight 434. So this guy, not only was he related to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the man who masterminded the 9/11 attacks in the early 90s, he's definitely concerned with Israel. But keep in mind, the ideas of Al-Qaeda are really in its infancy at this particular point. Just to recap, the Bojinga plot, they definitely were trying to engage in acts of terrorism, and it was going to involve a series of hijacking of planes. And all of these ideas were after the first 93 Trade Center bombing, which is the primary focus of this particular screencast. So again, this is in 94, where Ramzi Youssef was trying to bring down this particular Philippine airline. Pilot is able to land it. The clock watch that he placed on board the flight was not enough to bring the plane down. Also, part of the Bojinka plot, just look at that, they wanted to assassinate the Pope, hijack a series of planes, and use time bombs to really make some sort of political statement. Again, this is really about the 93 Trade Center bombing. So this is the first attack by Ramzi Youssef. Keep in mind, Al-Qaeda is not a thing at this point. Ramzi Youssef, is this guy acting on his own? Is he acting on ideas that are out there? We don't know. To understand first Trade Center bombing, we have to have some understanding of some of the architect. The entire Trade Center sat in what was called the bathtub. This whole area, the bathtub, which is in this particular image, you see the two towers right here, anchored into the ground, and the bathtub is this area that was just pretty much dug out, and cement was used to kind of lock this whole structure in. Here you see some of the bathtub right here. This will be addressed in a later screencast. Here you see the Trade Center. This would be the street level right here. And then these are called tridents, and they get anchored into the ground, which is kind of right here, the bedrock, the ground. Here you see another image while this stuff is You can see the bathtub right here. That's what that's called, bathtub. So the goal here is that they're trying to place a bomb in a Ryder truck in the parking garage. The parking garage would be in the lower level, right? Somewhere in this area, not necessarily under the bedrock, but here, this is, I believe, about 70 feet from the bedrock to the street level. So they're going to place this in the parking garage and detonate this. What's the motive? There we go, right here. Done in response for the American political, economic, and military support to Israel. Believes that the U.S. is a terroristic state. This guy is currently in this facility with Ted Kaczynski and Timothy McVeigh. He has some pretty good company. The guy who eventually finds him is this individual who's working for the FBI, John O'Neill. John O'Neill's story ends pretty sadly. He actually dies on 9/11 when he accepts a job as chief of security for the Trade Center facility. Pretty sad story. There's a reading about him and his associate Ali Soufan, who is also working to try to find Ramzi Youssef, this guy right here. And they are successful at finding this guy. Another attack here. You see two attacks in Africa. These are happening in 1998. Bin Laden would write his declaration of war in 1998, his 98 fatwa. Some of the people that they suspect to be responsible for the African bombings, the USS Cole bombing, Bin Laden's bodyguard at some point. Notice how this guy is currently at Guantanamo Bay. He had trained the 9/11 hijackers. And if you're wondering how could some of this stuff happen, you just put two SEALs, the FBI and the CIA. These two organizations were really not sharing information. The FBI, which normally works for domestic issues, and the CIA working on a global level. Like, these guys would want to bring people down for domestic terrorism. They're looking more global. So they're really not sharing information between each other. How do we know that? Well, in January 2000, we're looking at Khalid Mintar and Al Hazmi, two individuals attended a high-level Al-Qaeda meeting, and they were able to make it back into the United States. It's interesting to note that these two were in the country 2 years prior to 9/11. The CIA is aware of it, yet they're not sharing any of the information with the FBI, primarily because they don't want the FBI to arrest these guys, and that would destroy their global investigations. Pretty sad story there. According to the 9/11 Commission report, notice Ramzi Youssef and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed show up here. He entered the U.S. on an Iraqi passport as Ramzi Youssef. So this guy is in the United States conducting the 93 Trade Center attack. It's an odd point how they eventually get this, figure out the people responsible. This guy who's working with Ramzi Youssef keeps calling the rental office to get his deposit back. When you rent a truck, you got to put a deposit down, and he's really interested in getting his money back. I mean, at that point, Ramzi Youssef had already fled the country. And so this guy is just trying to figure out, hey, how am I going to get my money? And then before you know it, the rental agencies talk to the FBI. He's like, this guy's constantly calling for his money. FBI starts to investigate. Before you know it, they link him to Ramzi Youssef. And then the investigation by John O'Neill begins. February 4, 2000. These are just some memos that historically look at, some of the warnings. Like this one of 2000, Americans will die within the next 4 years of a terrorist attack. Richard Clark, counterterrorism advisor. Is Al-Qaeda a threat? I guess the answer is no until 9/11 takes place. Some other strange points. The jury begins hearing arguments about whether the owners of the Trade Center should be held liable for the 93 terrorist attack. That's an interesting point, and you'll see why that's an issue when we look at the architecture of the Trade Center. Notice here, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey was negligent in the 93 Trade Center bombing. What changes are they going to make from 93 to 2001? That's the big question. The USS Cole is a pretty simple speedboat packed with explosives. Right into the USS Cole, detonates, puts a hole in the vessel.
I have just been meeting with my national security team on today's tragic events in the Middle East. On one of our naval vessels. They were simply doing their duty. We are rushing medical assistance to the scene. If, as it now appears, this was an act of terrorism, it was a despicable and cowardly act. We will find out who was responsible and hold them accountable. If their intention was to deter us from our mission of promoting peace and security in the Middle East, they will fail utterly.
So another individual who's caught at Guantanamo Bay, suspected mastermind. Bin Laden in his video The Clouds. Look at this section right here. They believe that this was a reference to the USS Cole bombing. Before you know it, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, I mean, if you're able to strike the United States, that's going to be some credibility. And you start to see they produce a propaganda video. This is what, 2.5 years before 9/11. They galvanize Al Qaeda's recruitment effort, and this is in the 9/11 Commission report. And that's it.